Welcome everyone to our third part of our 7-part series exploring the landmark encyclical from Pope Francis, Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home. The series is called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. And tonight we're focusing on chapter 2, the Gospel of Creation. If you have not had an opportunity to see the first two or join us for one or the other, the first two sessions, they are up on the CCT website, and since obviously the encyclical builds on the chapters before it, we really warmly encourage you to go and look at those resources. So one other housekeeping detail, after our panelists have all had an opportunity to present, then there'll be a time for Q&A. And we'll do our Q&A as we've done in the past. So just please send your questions directly to Dr. Jeffrey Burns. And when your question is selected, he'll invite you to unmute yourself and to ask the question directly. So we've got a wonderful panel tonight and short amount of time. So without further ado, turn it over to Dr. Jeffrey Burns.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Jeffrey Burns for the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of San Diego. And it's my pleasure to welcome you. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, the Office of Mission, and the Care for Our Common Home Strategic Pathway and Department of Environmental Sciences. So welcome. We have an excellent panel tonight, and they're all very distinguished, very good scholars, very active in the community. But in light of the amount of time we have, I'm just going to briefly give their titles and then introduce them to do their talks. So we'll begin with Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry, who is the chair and an associate professor of the Theology and Religious Studies departments. So welcome, Emily. Following Emily will be Dr. Maureen Day, the associate professor of religion and society at the Franciscan School of Theology and a research fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Applied Research and Apostolate. Following Maureen will be Dr. Persephone Lewis, a tribal liaison at the University of San Diego and a professor of practice in ethnic studies. And we'll conclude with Father Emmet Farrell, the director of Creation Care Ministry for the Diocese of San Diego. So welcome to everyone and welcome to our panel. We're very glad you're here tonight, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, wonderful. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land on which our educational home stands is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I pay my respect to the Kumeyaay Nation and to their relationship to their ancestral lands. I'm going to be talking tonight about the importance of land and our relationship to the land and the spirituality of creation in light of what Pope Francis has to tell us in chapter 2 of Laudato Si on care for our common home. I find 3 major takeaways from this chapter. The first is hermeneutics, so how the Pope interprets the Bible. The second is evolutionary theory. So thinking about the relationship between science and religion, or between faith and reason is another way to think about that. And the third is the way that he talks about spirituality, which I find to be so energizing and affirming and uplifting. And that's the way that I'll close with my brief remarks. So first, when he's talking about hermeneutics, the first point I want to make here is that the Pope's method includes nature as sacred text. We frequently talk about the resources of the tradition and Bible as the major resources when thinking about Christian theology. And of course, those are really important, but he has a broader understanding of revelation within Laudato Si. And it's consistent with what theologians have been doing for some time, And what's so significant about this with regard to environmental ethics is that the Pope is talking about nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. So nature itself discloses God. Nature discloses the divine. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. The second point I want to make about hermeneutics is that the Pope makes this claim: what the Bible says is not what the Bible means. In other words, that the Bible must be interpreted. And of course, this is a traditional Catholic way of thinking about the Bible, but it's often overlooked when we read more fundamentalist approaches to the Bible, even among Catholic clergy or magisterial documents. And I would say we see this more often in sexual ethics than in social ethics. But here we have this reminder that the Bible is a sacred text, but it must be interpreted. So for example, he says in 67, when he's rejecting the dominion model of interpreting Genesis 1:28, he says this is not a correct interpretation of the Bible. He goes on to say the biblical texts are to be read in their context with an appropriate hermeneutic. So just acknowledging that one needs to have a hermeneutic for approaching a sacred text and to disclose that and think about what the Bible means as different necessarily than what it says. The third point is that his hermeneutical key for understanding the revelation of the Bible is relationship. And what does it mean to be in right relationship with God, with ourselves, and with one another, and with the created world? So throughout, he implies a relationship of mutual responsibility. He says the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living beings. And he talks about, when he's drawing on the Gospels, that Jesus lived in full harmony with creation. So for example, the Pope says in number 99, one person of the Trinity entered into the created cosmos, throwing in his lot with it, even to the cross. So this is one way of talking about the incarnational theology present within Laudato Si, that Jesus is in harmony with creation and his ministry is in harmony with the created world. So in conclusion for this section, revelation is ongoing. That's a radical claim in theology. But this is a very exciting claim too, because it also invites us to understand how God continues to disclose God's self within our interpretation of sacred tradition, sacred scripture, and then also the natural world, the sacred natural world. So he says the universe as a whole, in all its manifold relationships, shows forth the inexhaustible riches of God. Moving very quickly through some key points, the evolutionary theory is the next theme that I want to highlight. And the point here is to say that theology is not afraid of science. So what the Pope says here is that we need to draw on the results of the best scientific research available to us today. We should not be afraid to be in dialogue with science. We should not be afraid the theologians should not be afraid to dialogue with those who are experts within these other disciplines, because that's one of the ways that we're going to be able to find some common ground and also work together to solve these very complex problems. He says science and religion, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue fruitful for both. So faith and reason go hand in hand. They're not the same, but they can work together. And I think that he would say the same in terms of these different disciplines. A second major point is that Catholics do not reject evolutionary theory. So there are some more fundamentalist traditions within Christianity that do reject evolutionary theory in favor of creation science or intelligent design. But that's not where Catholicism lands. And it's in part because of that openness to the best science of our day and understanding the importance of dialogue with science. So we see this in 81. And one of the things that's important to note here is that he does reaffirm how human beings continue to have this capacity for reason, love, and relationship with God. And that is unique, and that is very important. but he does not reject evolutionary theory in order to affirm that. If you're interested in further reflection on that point, then I would recommend these books by John Hott, Elia Delio, and Elizabeth Johnson, which if I had it longer, I would explain in more detail. Finally, I'm going to conclude by talking about a third theme I see in this chapter, which is the spirituality of the encyclical, but especially of this chapter. And that is the spirituality of stop, listen, breathe, be. The importance of paying attention to the natural world, of paying attention to what's going on around us, and recognizing ourselves as interdependent within creation. So one of the poets who I find really captures this well is Mary Oliver. This is a selection from Entering the Kingdom. She writes, "The dream of my life is to lie down by a slow river and stare at the light in the trees, to learn something by being nothing, a little while, but the rich lens of attention." So paying attention to the natural world is a form of prayer. We can also think of the natural world as giving us a hug. So being in nature is a caress of God, according to Pope Francis in number 84. And he says in 85, "This contemplation of creation allows us to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand on to us. There is divine manifestation in the blaze of sun and the fall of night." So it invites us to think about our creatureliness in relationship to God as creator and in relationship to the rest of creation. And that again highlights that sense of interdependence. Finally, one of my favorite quotes leads us to the sense of how paying attention to the natural world can also then motivate us towards ethical action. So in 95, "The natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity, and the responsibility of everyone." Thank you. I look forward to being in dialogue with all of the other panelists tonight. Those are my brief reflections.
Thank you very much, Emily. We're going to turn it now to Dr. Maureen Day. And
thank you. Just one moment while I pull up my slides, please.
yeah, she's pulling up her slides. Just a reminder that tonight's presentation will be available on the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture's YouTube channel, so you can follow this more closely, particularly the slides.
And do we see a first slide here?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great. So thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Reimer-Barry, for introducing us to thinking in new ways. I'm going to be focusing on the theme of tenderness that happens throughout the second chapter of Laudato Si. And so as I begin to talk about Laudato Si and tenderness, I think it might not make sense initially, but to go back to Pope Francis's encyclical on the joy of love, Amoris Laetitia, where this is where we first see tenderness make a really strong debut within Pope Francis's thoughts. And what he writes in his encyclical on the family, or he writes, "Tenderness, on the other hand, is a sign of a love free of selfish possessiveness. It makes us approach a person with immense respect and a certain dread of causing them harm or taking away their freedom. Loving another person involves the joy of contemplating and appreciating their innate beauty and sacredness, which is greater than my needs. This enables me to seek their good, even when they cannot belong to me, or when they are no longer physically appealing, but intrusive and annoying." And I brought this quote in and thought about tenderness, and because we talk about family life and tenderness, but we also refer to the earth, as the title of Laudato Si does, as our common home. And so how can we begin to imagine our home and creation differently if we were to bring the same values of family and into this? And so I'm not going to be pulling on Amoris Laetitia here on out. I'll be pulling on Laudato Si, but just to highlight some of the things in this paragraph and how it can apply to nature: a love free of selfish possessiveness. immense respect, a certain dread of causing harm or taking away freedom, a joy of contemplating and appreciating their innate beauty and sacredness, and to seek their good even when they cannot belong to me. And even things like, when I think about things that are intrusive and annoying about creation, maybe mosquitoes, for instance, that doesn't produce a rupture in my relationship with creation, because there's this well of tenderness and a sense that even the mosquitoes have an important role to play in these things. All right, so what are some qualities of tenderness that I'm going to want to set the stage with? Well, first of all, tenderness is quiet. Tenderness is, unlike a lot of other virtues that we think about, like, for example, courage, justice, joy. These can have their quiet forms, but they can also have their loud forms and their more obvious forms. Tenderness is nearly always something that is done in the quiet, in the intimacy of a small group, two people or a small group. Also, tenderness hurts. So tenderness hurts. Why does tenderness hurt? When we talk about, even our muscles after a workout, we talk about them being tender. There's a certain element to practicing a virtue of tenderness that requires us to be vulnerable, to open ourselves up to other people. And yes, we rejoice when they rejoice, but we also hurt when they hurt as well. And so it's an empathic virtue that really connects us to others, which is another way that tenderness opens us further. So tenderness can begin with one action, one practice that we begin, one way of looking at the world, but it will tend to spiral us outward. As we change our practices, our imagination expands and we see other things in new light, and that causes us to grow in tenderness, so on and so forth. So it becomes this self-enforcing model of being. And so as we look to Laudato Si, what is the problem that is identified within the second chapter? And it can be kind of summed up in broken relationships. So Pope Francis writes, human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin. And so we can talk about broken relationships. We can see how Pope Francis talks about broken relationships with God in Laudato Si. And I've just underlined a few pieces that I want us to especially hone into in these various excerpts. So nowadays, we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures. A proper understanding of the scriptures, as Dr. Reimer-Barry alluded to, implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. And as we go on, we can talk about broken relationships with neighbor. Pope Francis notes that some are mired in desperate and degrading poverty with no way out, while others have not the faintest idea of what to do with their possessions, vainly showing off their supposed superiority and leaving behind them so much waste. In practice, we continue to tolerate that some consider themselves more human than others, as if they had been born with greater rights. And finally, part of the broken relationships is with the earth. It would also be mistaken to view other living beings as mere objects subjected to arbitrary human domination. When nature is viewed solely as a source of profit and gain, this has serious consequences for society. This vision of might as right has engendered immense inequality, injustice, and acts of violence against the majority of humanity, since resources end up in the hands of the first comer or the most powerful. The winner takes all. Completely at odds with this model are the ideals of harmony, justice, fraternity, and peace as proposed by Jesus. So we see that there's the series of broken relationships that we are not living in proper relationship with God, with neighbor, or with the earth. And he points out that we are at a crossroads. So as Pope Francis looks around at these broken relationships and he reflects on the potential, both the good and the ill, that are present in technology, progress, and power, he says, this is what makes for the excitement and drama of human history, in which freedom, growth, salvation, and love can blossom or can lead towards decadence and mutual destruction. So we're at this point, we've got a lot of power, we've got a lot of technology, and we can see the ways that it can heal, and we can see the ways that has been used for these variety of vices. And so how can tenderness inform the way that we can choose to go down a road in which freedom, growth, and salvation and love can blossom? So tenderness, the ways that this operates is we can see him talking about how God gives to us tenderly. Creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion. So our creation is given tenderly, and as we look at that, we are invited to respond to God's generosity with gratitude, with greater tenderness and appreciation for all of that is around us, and that we get to be a part of this. And every creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of his love, and in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with his affection. And so we can see here that Pope Francis is proposing a theology where God is very tender. God's self is a tender God reaching out to us, enfolding even the smallest and the least of beings, the ones that are most vulnerable in tender affection. And then also, he speaks about God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. He pulls this also, this is from Joy of the Gospel as well, this particular quote, but it is also within Laudato Si. And so we can see that as we are invited to tenderness, yes, was when we see the pain and that we are causing in the world, destroying the beautiful creation that God has provided, that we will feel those pains. Again, tenderness hurts, but it's still an invitation that does not need to leave us, sitting in the corner in pain, but that pain can be mobilized into greater awareness and to reach out and to stand up for creation. And then just to touch on one final idea is the power of universal communion. Pope Francis writes, when our hearts are authentically open to universal communion, the sense of fraternity excludes nothing and no one. It follows that our indifference or cruelty toward fellow creatures of this world sooner or later affects the treatment we mete out to other human beings. Everything is related, and we human beings are united as brothers and sisters on a wonderful pilgrimage, woven together by the love God has for each of his creatures, and which also unites us in fond affection with brother sun, sister moon, brother river, and mother earth. And so we see that it's not just a communion with God, it's not just a communion with neighbor, it's also a communion with the earth that we're being invited into for all of creation to rejoice together. And that concludes my presentation, and I will stop the share and gladly pass it to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Maureen. It was very much appreciated. And we're going to turn it over to Percy right now.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. So I have to start off by saying I'm not a theologian, unlike some of the other members of the panel. I'm also not Catholic. So I was pretty interested when I was asked to do this talk. And I have to say, I greatly enjoyed it. So thank you for this opportunity. I really see my space on this panel as being more in conversation with Laudato Si. We talk about it a lot being at USD, and I had never read the entire thing. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I especially appreciated really digging into this chapter. So I just want to start with some terms really quickly. When I say Native American, I'm really referring to the first peoples of the United States. And within the United States, we have 574 federally recognized tribes, in addition to a couple hundred other state recognized tribes. So I am really just one voice. I am a citizen of the Yamba Band of Shoshone Indians. So my perspectives are really coming from my tribal teachings and the ways of knowing of the Western Shoshone people. When I refer to Alaska Natives, I'm referring to the first peoples of present-day Alaska. They are actually organized differently from those of us in the lower 48. And then when I say Indigenous, I'm referring to first peoples who really have a recognized special relationship to the land as a political entity under the United Nations with certain rights and connections to their lands. So I thought this chapter was so interesting, the gospel of creation. It really had me thinking about our creation stories. I think right now with all of the issues and really the terrible situations that are happening as a result of climate change, creation stories play a really important role in how we relate to the earth, how we relate to our environment, how we relate to one another. So just to offer a little bit of an Indigenous epistemology, we are in relation with the land, which I have a capital L land, which Cheryl Stiers, who is an Indigenous researcher in Canada, argues includes everything within a place. So that would be the stars, the heavens, all of the land, the living creatures within the land, the water, the subterranean as well. So our creation stories ground us to a place and really grounds us to certain features of a place, plants of a place, animals of a place. We are really seen as being not even as smart as animals, kind of a little bit below animals. Many of our creation stories actually tell stories of us coming to this place and not being as smart and really having to learn from the animals. So our relationships are much different with the environment around us. And then being in relationship, which is really how we view it. I think in Laudato Si, the Pope speaks a lot about responsibility. And for us, being in relationship means there is a responsibility. Sean Wilson, who is a Canadian researcher, describes that as relational accountability, which requires three things. It requires respect, care, and responsibility. So to be in relationship with anything, human or non-human, those three values are really expected and are part of that. And I think that really comes out in this encyclical, the conversations around respect and being in relationship, being in communion, and that aspect of care, caring for a place, caring for people who are more vulnerable. And I really saw some great intersections with this piece of writing. I think, the mystery of the universe is section 76. I can let you read the first part, but I really want to just focus on where he writes, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion. So for me, when I read that, I just thought of how, within my traditions as a Shoshone person, we do see creation as being a gift. So, when I was taught the proper way to pray as a Shoshone person, we give thanks for everything before we begin, asking for strength or those other things that are commonly included in prayers. So we give thanks for all of the life. We give thanks for the water. For us, praying for water, it's our most sacred relationship. And so that's always included in the beginning of a prayer, and then it's also included at the end, right? So part of our responsibility of being in relationship with land is that we also have these spiritual responsibilities. And just an example, my grandmother, my reservation is in the mountains. We're 7,000 feet in central Nevada, dry. Nevada is a very dry place. But we had a really wet year around the state and places were flooded. And I was with my grandma and I asked her, I said, how is it out in Yamba, which is the name of my reservation? Did they get a lot of rain this year? And she said, no, they didn't get a lot of rain because you know how those people are, they don't pray. So it's so interesting because for her, right, the reason why we didn't get rain in Yamba is because folks were not upholding their responsibility in that relationship, the responsibility of care and the responsibility of including the welfare of our water and our lands in those prayers. And I think there's lots of other examples, from other tribes where we do see this connection of everything around us sort of being a gift, and that gift is also grounded in reciprocity, right? And the responsibilities that we have to ensure that that it's doing as well as we are. I also really thought a lot of how this section ended, together into universal communion. I think I don't hear relationships with nature put in that sort of way. And to me, it just really intersected with how I was raised to think about, these relationships that we have with things alive and those things that are naturally around us. And then another passage that I thought was really great was 84. It's the message of each creature and the harmony of creations. So the part that I will highlight, it says, the history of our friendship with God is always linked to particular places, which take on an intensely personal meaning. We all remember places, and revisiting those memories does us much good. And for Indigenous people, because we come from a place, it is that place that defines us. So everything comes from our lands. Our language comes from our lands, our practices, our ceremonies, all of those things are tied to our lands. And in our oral traditions, those connections and those ties go all the way back. So, we have stories from my tribe. Nevada used to be a large lake, it was flooded. And our oral tradition actually takes us to that period, the Pleistocene period, where we're waiting. We're waiting for the waters to leave. We're waiting for our pine nuts, which is our main staple. In California, the native people ate a lot of acorns, and that was something that could be stored and a great source of fat and energy. And for us, it's our pine nuts. And so our stories tell of us waiting for a time for our pine nuts to be able to come into abundance, to be able to feed us and nourish us and allow our existence. So special relationships, were put in place around how we pray for that and how we give thanks, right? Because we waited so long for them to come. And I think, oftentimes we do link place to being in relationship with God. And I think that's why a lot of people love the outdoors, and especially now during COVID, I hear many people talk about how being outside and being in communion has helped them to be able to get through the pandemic. Sorry, that's my timer. I have to time myself. So I think there's many intersections, and I think as we continue to deal with this crisis, we will need to draw from Indigenous spiritualities and understandings and ways of knowings in order to be able to navigate it as we continue to have to deal with the fallout. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Percy, for a wonderful presentation. We're going to go to Father Emmet now. So I'll turn it over to him. You need to unmute yourself, Father.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So being the fourth speaker, I might be duplicating some other things that have been said, and I might reach outside of chapter 2 to back up some of my points. But first of all, I want to say that when we hear about the gospel of anything, we always think of the Bible and scripture. That's our first thought, But there is another revelation that God makes. We can see it in the tree here. This is back in my home state of Iowa, but the beauty. And God reveals himself through nature. Every creature is a thought of God, Francis says, And in Matthew 26, for example, he says, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, and yet God takes care of them. That's divine providence taking care of us. Beauty we see all around us, but sometimes we don't appreciate it so much. But we try in our country, for instance, to preserve the beauty in creating our oceans or protecting our oceans and our national parks and our ancestral lands. We try to protect this from short-term profit making. And a good example of that would be what's happening in Brazil, in the Amazon. Pope Francis had a whole synod on it. Our bishop went to that synod. It had a lot to do with the indigenous people, their way of life and their culture. And the Amazon is called the lungs of the world by Francis because the trees absorb carbon and they give off oxygen. Probably the best example of someone who saw God in creation was St. Francis of Assisi. In his canticle, but all throughout his life, respecting life the God in plants and animals and humans. The bishops of Brazil put it in this way. They said that creation is the locus of God. It's the place where God dwells. That is, in essence, the gospel of creation. We look at the book of Genesis, especially 2:15. It says that creation is a day-by-day process, but it ends up by creating humans. And in 2:15, it says we are to till for our sustenance, but we also must protect. That makes us sort of cooperators. It makes us stewards. And God has given us special talents. And I'm forgetting to move the slides ahead here. This is the Amazon. This is creation. And we're given things as a gift. And all of creation is a gift to us. And we humans, as time has gone along, have dominated the earth, and we begun to overconsume, overproduce, and waste. And we do that through the use of chemicals, especially carbon dioxide into the air. But also we do it through the waste of plastics and styrofoams, like the garbage patch in the Pacific, which is twice the size of Texas. Patriarch Bartholomew said that for humans to contaminate the soil, the air, and the water, these are sins. Because an offense against a fellow human or against nature is an offense against the Creator. We have no such right. So it's human domination that's taking place. It's like almost replacing God. We've forgotten about the social cost of our stewardship, meaning the environment and future generations. God has mandated us to till and protect. Someone said we've done a great job of tilling, but not such a good job of protecting. And so our responsible stewardship is something that God may be disappointed with our stewardship. We're told also that what we have as gifts from God is not our own. It's given to us as a gift, but the church father said, what we have we don't absolutely need is not ours. It belongs to the poor. And Pope Francis mentions the poor 73 times in the encyclical. And I began to wonder, who is he talking about? Why so often? Finally, he says, the majority of the planet. The bishops of New Zealand said, what does it mean when we say thou shalt not kill, when 20% of the earth's population consume at a rate which robs the poor of what they need to survive? In the 5th century, Pope Leo the Great said, use creatures as they should be used. Earth, the water, the sky, the springs, the rivers. Give praise to God and glory for these creations and the things that are beautiful. And finally, we ask, he says, that you use things reasonably, that is to say, with moderation. I'm sure that we have all heard a phrase that comes supposedly from Mother Teresa. The poor are mentioned 73 times, and they're the majority. Mother Teresa was supposed to have said something that didn't appear on the slide here, live simply that others might simply live. And so we're asked to live in moderation. When I give my workshops in the 97 parishes around the diocese, I try to get not just the theory, but action steps. The goal of Laudato Si, Francis says in paragraph 19, is that we just don't increase our information, but we actually end up doing something about it. So I like to give them something, a checklist. And this is a simple version of it, but we start with ourselves, with our home, with our family. We move out maybe to our parish, our church community, and there's things we can do there. And then we go further out yet. If we really are passionate, we are serious about our stewardship, and we look at the civil society and policy. So action steps, I think that that's the goal Francis says, of his creation and the world. He gives us a roadmap. And he says we are stewards. And his plan, he gave us a plan to follow. We are to till, we are to protect. And he says to us that our faith, or rather the way he says that Christians should realize that their responsibility to the Creator and to all of creation is an essential part of our faith. In other words, it's not something peripheral. Many people think, well, this is all politics, it's all economy. I say, no, it is essentially spiritual. It's moral because it has to do with our attitudes, our actions, and that is very spiritual. It's our stewardship of the earth. In chapter 13 of Corinthians, verse 12, he says, at the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God. One thing we should not do, and that is to be indifferent. Desmond Tutu said, we are all part of the problem, therefore we're all part of the solution. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the good Lutheran theologian, said that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. So we must do something. That's the goal of Laudato Si. I sometimes end up my workshops and I say, with the song, I play it, go make a difference in the world. Together, we can do that. We can make a difference. We can change the world. It's called ecological conversion or ecological spirituality. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Father Emmet. Thank you to our panelists for a wonderful series of presentations. Father Emmet, if you could stop sharing your screen. And I would encourage people, if they have a question, to please write your question in the chat function. And as we start to receive questions, I would ask if our panelists have any reaction to their fellow panelists before we take any other questions. So I'll give you a chance to say something.
I'm just impressed about how different perspectives from our different preparations, from theology, from science, from nature, all the different ways of focusing on one thing, which is our creation and what it says to us.
Thank you.
I was going to also express my gratitude to the other panelists, but pick up on what Percy was talking about in terms of creation stories. I mean, when I was getting excited about talking about hermeneutics, that big crazy, I'm sorry, that big crazy academic word, part of my enthusiasm is because once we start to talk about the interpretation of sacred texts, then it opens up this whole exciting world to think. For example, when we're talking about Genesis, there's not just one creation story, but two. And there's this really exciting way of thinking about how those creation stories have been interpreted throughout the tradition. And so there's a development in thinking about our relationship to the natural world. I think that sometimes, especially in catechism, at least I see this sometimes in religious education, then the Genesis creation stories are presented in a more literal framework. And it doesn't always help our moral imagination in the way that if we presented it as myth and story that conveys deep truths about our relationship to the natural world. And so if we think about it in terms of a comparative analysis, comparative especially to some of the stories that Percy was talking about from the Shoshone experience and from other Native traditions, I think that just opens up this whole exciting conversation about how story can really convey truth, but to do it in a way that's not, a fundamentalist kind of rigid analysis.
Thank you. Okay, we have a number of questions now. I would ask Dr. Andrew Allen to unmute himself and ask his question.
You're still muted, Andy.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, you should be able to do it now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. And in particular, my comment had to do with, I was really moved by the idea of the broken relationships. And I was wondering, in a country that's so divided as our country is, how do we mend our relationships with our neighbors who believe in alternative facts and have a different perception of what's going on?
I could begin with that. I think that part of it, and Dr. Reimer-Barry and Percy were both talking about the importance of storytelling. And oftentimes when we know that there's going to be a different perspective from ours, rather than talking, we debate. And when debate happens, everyone loses at the end of the day. So I think that when we push for when we want dialogue, that storytelling is a really great way to begin, because it puts a human context on our stories and it makes us more empathic to the perspective that we're hearing. And even if we don't necessarily agree at the end of the conversation, we'll at least have a better understanding of where that person is grounded in and what sort of values are animating their concerns. And that's day one. So the key is also not to try to solve everything day one. And to have a long-term view of building relationships with people who are very different from ourselves. That's I'll pass it to the other panelists. So
I would want to say that Pope Francis answered that when he wrote Fratelli Tutti, that we're all one. I like the phrase that he uses, we're one family, we live in one house. If we could understand and really appreciate that, we would treat others much differently. But he says we listen, we dialogue, we go out to the other. We don't lock on our silos. We listen to news medias that we normally don't use to see what others are thinking. We have to understand the other person. Otherwise, we are in our silos. But I'll just leave it at that. Fratelli Tutti would be a good answer to it. We did a whole workshop on that with the Jewish and the Muslim faiths, just to be able to understand one another.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's move to Jim de Harcourt has a question. Jim, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just want to know if you clarify, we often hear about dominion, having dominion, and many people approach creation that way. And now we're talking more about stewardship. How did that change and why did it change? And how do you respond to people who think that we have dominion over creation?
Thank you for that question. I'll briefly take an opportunity to talk about that. So the dominion interpretation is a dominant interpretation within the Christian tradition. And it comes from a reading, of the Genesis creation narrative that sees the human person as the climax of the creation story, and that interprets the gifts given to the human person and responsibility given to the human person for taking care of creation as a power over creation. But what Pope Francis is highlighting within this chapter, but also elsewhere throughout the document, is that that power over creation is not just problematic in the ways that it's led to exploitation of the natural earths, of the resources of the earth, but that it also sets up this power dynamic where we think we have more power than we do. And it's a false theological anthropology, because the theological anthropology that he's trying to set up instead is one where the human person is a part of creation. The human person is embedded within relationships. We depend on creation for our flourishing. So it's really more of a mutual interdependent flourishing model. And that's where stewardship is better. Stewardship, some theologians would say, doesn't go far enough in talking about the sense in which we are responsible for taking care of the earth, but still not in a diminutive way. but stewardship is definitely better. Dan Horan, who's a Franciscan theologian, talks about kinship as, perhaps an even improved terminology to stewardship. So when we think about kinship with the natural world, then that's a very different kind of posture.
We have a follow-up question from a Jay Wikorama. Can you unmute yourself? Keith, excuse me. Keith is his first name. So Keith, if you could unmute yourself.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks. So it's always troubled me, the words, dominate, have dominion and subdue. And I just wonder whether a wrong interpretation was given way back, because I think it's led to enormous amount of damage. So powerful words, and they have been used or misused by people who wanted to do stuff like that. So I was wondering if there's any thought that that was actually a misinterpretation. Thank you.
I mean, I'll just say, not want to qualify my response that I'm not a biblical scholar, and so that's not my area of expertise. But just to note that it's early in the creation story that people are given dominion over the earth, but it isn't until after the flood that they're allowed to eat animals as meat. And so even when dominion is given early on, it doesn't mean full reign of whatever you want to do, that it's later on. So yeah, just to qualify, that's one thing I'd throw out. I'm hoping that other people can respond better.
One of our speakers from next week, Kate DeConnick, sends in a message that there's also a passage about dominion and stewardship in chapter 3 of Laudato Si. It's a promo for next week. And it reinforces everything that Emily said. So we can look forward to that next week as well. But let's go to Michelle, has a question. Michelle Boudria.
Hi, Percy, first, we were strategic. We really wanted to bring as many interpretation. And the reason I want to ask you the question is, Laudato Si has often been seen as a letter to the world. It's an encyclical, but it really wasn't just for the Catholic Church. It really was for everyone from all faiths. It was to talk about the earth as its place. So kind of connecting back to some of the early components, how do you see that bringing in indigenous stories and the storytelling ideas can really help spread that message that care for the common home is an everyone issue, not a specific group issue?
Thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, reading this, I saw it as like a cry out for help, and I think that Indigenous people have been crying out for help for a long time because we've seen this coming. And even, if you look at prophecies from tribes, the Haudenosaunee on the East Coast, the Anishinaabe, they have prophecies where they saw this destruction coming to the earth. And some of them actually moved from where they were at to come more into the interior of the United States. So I think, that they're just all cries, to say, look what is happening and we have to do something. So I think that there is room for all of it, but especially Indigenous knowledges, because we are closest to the earth. And if you look at climate change in the Arctic, I mean, these elders are just crying out, major things are happening. But it's just a question of, will people hear them? And that's what I'm concerned about. I mean, the Pope has the largest audience and we're still continuing with our behaviors. So I think at some point, everyone will be crying out and hopefully something will change.
I think Pope Francis addressed that in his Querida Amazonia, on the synod that he called on the Amazon. He was saying that the indigenous really know how it's the good life, living well, and we need to learn from them many things that we've forgotten. And I think that's his answer, that many things that the indigenous know, we need to learn to them. And as far as the Amazon is concerned, we're not going to tell them. They have to decide where it goes, and we join them in their vision of how to take care of the Amazon.
Thank you. Let me ask Percy, there's been a greater awareness of sacred spaces of Indigenous peoples currently, or in the last few years, but are you optimistic about that catching hold?
I hope so. And I think, also that passage that I had referred to, the last one about place, I mean, every place is sacred. So, I always tell students at USD, you're walking on thousands of years, right? Documented Kumeyaay existence, 12,000 years. You're walking on sacred spaces. You're walking on where people have been buried, where they have been born constantly. And we need to, maybe that's the answer. Maybe when we start to see space and place as sacred in the same way, we'll want to protect it and have a relationship with it.
Thank you.
Can I jump in there, Jeff?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm just going to mention briefly that one of the lovely things about celebrating Mass during COVID for my family is that we've been able to practice a Facebook Mass in our backyard with the birds chirping. And there's just, I mean, I know that we are living through terrible times, and the reason why we're celebrating Mass outdoors, it is just full of suffering. And yet for so many people, celebrating liturgy outdoors has been such a gift. And I hope, for one, that that's something that we don't just lose. There's something sacred about being in a church space. And yet I think Laudato Si is also pushing us to see the sacred in other kinds of spaces. And also that opens up our spiritual imagination in really creative ways, if we could follow through with that.
Jeff, can I make a quick comment connecting to last week?
Yes.
So one of the last questions we were asked last week when we were talking about the sort of care for a common home from the bigger perspective is for all of us to think about that space that we remember, be it now or when we were young. And I think everybody was able to find that space in nature that brings back memories. And so I do think it's a very powerful connection we have, be it a river, or an ocean, a tree. And so I think it's important to reconnect to that part of us, because it makes us connected to the earth and want to take care of it.
Thank you. I want to go to Patricia Grace. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment? Are you there, Patricia?
I'm here. I am. And I can't get on. Here we go. Deep apologies for being late. I didn't get the link, and I'm very, very sorry. I'll check the recording. I think there is one. I just wanted to say an amen to what Dr. Emily said about there are some comments that perhaps even the concept of stewardship, it cuts short of what the Holy Father really is alluding to. And so I wrote that that really I'm a secular Franciscan, third order Franciscan, and our rule says that we should strive to move from the temptation of exploiting creation to the Franciscan concept of universal kinship. And I just love it, because I look at the moon and the moon looks at me. I look at the earth looks at me. And it's that reciprocity of kinship that makes us fall deeply in love with each other. And then we care for it. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're almost out of time. I want to give our panelists a chance to make any final statement they might have. So if you have a statement, just wave your hand and make it.
I might just say that Emily mentioned how Mass outside, we hear the birds and so on. In his book, Let Us Dream, Pope Francis says that we can't come out of COVID the same. We have to move ahead. We have to learn from it. And I think that's one of the things, maybe, sometimes I think that COVID is maybe a bad way of trying to get us to wake up to some of the lessons. And maybe that's one of them. It's just one little one, but I think there's a lot of other lessons that we can learn. The one I think is, for me, the most powerful is, we're one family, we live in one house. Figure that out and live by it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep circling back to Keith's question, which is a really good one. And what I'm thinking of is that I think one of the ways I would begin to answer that is to say that Laudato Si is really in alignment with this call to smash the patriarchy. That what we see within Laudato Si is an example of how Pope Francis is sensitive to how power dynamics of domination and submission, or domination and subordination, have really led to deep exploitation and broken relationships. And so it's a call for a more feminist understanding of communion and egalitarian relationships rooted in solidarity and dignity and towards ultimate communion and kinship. And so I think that, to go back to Keith's question, yes, there was a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of sacred scripture, and we're called now to this deeper new awareness. And so part of that misinterpretation is that there's this, real legacy of patriarchal domination, and we really need to see Pope Francis kind of in alignment with a feminist critique of that.
Thank you. Well, if there are no other comments, I'm going to go to Trey McDonald. Trey, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, you want to make your statement?
Oh, it was just sort of an extension on what Father Emmet was discussing, and identifying things that people could do in their daily lives to help out and live more sustainably. And I think it's really important to consider how we vote, both politically and where we vote with our dollars, because those are the two things that are really going to change the system in the long run.
Thank you. Well, thank you all to our panelists. To remind you that this presentation will be available on the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture YouTube channel. And I want to turn it over to Michelle to take us home.
Well, once again, I think we continue to outdo ourselves. I think it was wonderful to have our panel bring in the different perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and answering our questions. And I liked where we were going and why we all really are living on one planet, as Father Emmet said, and we should all just take care of it. Next week, we're moving on to chapter 3. We'll be bringing in different perspectives. We'll have a theology perspective, we will have a sociology perspective, and a political science perspective, really looking at the human roots of this ecological crisis. So we will continue our series with 3 distinguished panelists from USD, and Jeff will be moderating again. So thank you for coming this week. Hopefully we'll see most of you or all of you next week, and there's a few more to go after that.
Same time, same station.